Good morning, everybody. This is Jeff Meisner with Avalara. I'm the Senior Developer Marketing Manager at the company. I hope everyone can hear us. In the room, we have Mark Wilhelm, our presenter, Sarah Simrell, and Bob Birdman, all from the partner launch team. And then we also have Katina Montez and Wayne Meyer from the Dev Relations team in engineering. And I am going to turn it over to Mark. Go ahead.
All right. Thank you, Jeff. As Jeff indicated, Mark Wilhelm. I'll be presenting and going over our webinar today. Member of Avalara's business development team, actually in charge of our partner launch team. Our partner launch team works with our signed solutions and technology partners to design, certify, launch new integrations, and have been with Avalara for 14 years now. And today's session, we're going to be talking about 7 essential tax features for your ERP application. It's going to be more of a functional review, and we'll be talking about a variety of topics. Of which we'll be starting off with some address validation and talking about how address validation is impactful, especially when performing tax calculations with Avalara services. We'll then move on and talk a little bit about tax estimates and how they should be operated and managed throughout the ERP. We'll also make a stop and talk about a slightly new topic and cover a brief overview of our customs duty and import tax functionality that Avalara is bringing to bear. We'll then talk about finalizing tax on invoices and that process of finalizing invoices and making sure that we have transactional data for the merchant or the seller to be able to manage. We'll then talk about refunds, the unfortunate process by which sometimes good sales come to an end with the need for a refund, a product return, or some type of credit memo, and best practices around those refunds. We'll then talk a little bit about exemption certificate management and how with Avalara services you can facilitate through your ERP solution managing exemption certificates. And then finally, more of an administrative function, talking about controls and configurations that will make you a hero with your ERP users whenever they're dealing with tax integrations, especially those from Avalara services. We'll start with address validation. And with address validation, one of the key components here with Avalara and the importance of the address is Avalara doesn't leverage geocoding, or we're not asking you to pre-assign some type of geocode or identifier to any particular address where you're delivering a product to or might be delivering a service at. We're going to, through the Avalara service and the AvaTax tax calculation component, we're going to be leveraging address information directly and leveraging that to do tax determination and sourcing of tax jurisdictions. And then part of that process will then lead to the calculation of an accurate tax. The reason that addresses are so important and why we provide an address validation function, what I'm going to do is jump off here for just a moment and come over here to a website. You'll see this is actually a public-facing website. Anyone can get to it. It's avataxrates.com. But what this is a good visualization of how Avalara manages tax jurisdiction boundaries and how those boundaries are identified during a tax calculation request. The map that you're seeing here is essentially a patchwork or an overview of what we call tax regions. Each of those different colors that you're seeing on the map identifies a different collection of tax jurisdictions, whether they be a state levying a tax, a county within that state, a city that levies a tax, or what we call a special tax jurisdiction, which is typically a regional taxing authority, whereby that regional taxing authority has levied a tax and typically earmarks it for a special or unique purpose. And leveraging this geospatial mapping and the mapping of these address regions, what Avalara does is when we get an address, and I'm going to go up here and put an address in, it's 8150 East Colfax. And I'm going to pick that in Denver. During that brief moment in time, what it did is it took us directly to where that address is located. And what you're going to see here is that when I zoom in, it's identified, again, this purple or red or pink region, depending on how that's displaying on your monitor. But that is the jurisdiction and the specific point where that address is found. That address then rendered an 8.31% tax rate, which is an aggregation of the state levy tax at 2.9%, City of Denver tax at 4.31%, and then what you're seeing is those special or regional taxes, the first being the Regional Transit District of Greater Denver at 1%, and we're also intersecting with the Scientific and Cultural Facilities tax at 0.1%. And to give you an idea of the granularity of that, if I drill in a little bit here, I'm looking at an address, and let's say that my address was a few blocks east and on the north side of Colfax. There you're now going to see an 8.5% tax rate. I've now moved into a different tax region. I'm still picking up the state of Colorado, as you would expect, but I'm also picking up Adams County, the city of Aurora. I'm no longer in the city of Denver, but you'll see those two specials, the Regional Transit District and the Scientific and Cultural Facilities tax, all came along for the ride. Had my address been directly across the street, now you're seeing an 8% tax rate, and if you were watching the monitor, you'll notice that the primary driver, or the only driver here for the difference, is I'm no longer in Adams County. When I crossed over and went to the south side of Colfax, I now am in Arapahoe County, moving out of Adams County. And my point being, and I'm going to go back here to my PowerPoint. My point being, address validation is very important because validating that I'm using an accurate address is going to ensure that when that address is used in a tax calculation process, we know we have an accurate address. And then the Avalara service can then identify and document exactly where that is. And actually what we do is during the tax calculation process, we take that address and we convert that into a latitude longitude coordinate. And it's a 6 decimal place lat long coordinate that we assign to each and every address that we process. And that lat long coordinate gives us an identifier of within 30 feet exactly where on the map that address lies, which gives us an accurate identifier then to identify the intersecting tax regions or tax jurisdictions on that point in the map. Also, we have a variety of address types. So destination, obviously one of the more common ones. This is, or the ship to address. This is if it's a product, where I am shipping that product to. It could also be where I'm delivering the service at. If I'm sending out a service person to a particular address to render a service, then we're going to leverage that ship to or destination address for that service as well. We pick up an origin address that identifies for products where the product was shipping from. So we also anecdotally call it the ship from address. And you'll also see that there are 2 other address types that I have listed here: point of order acceptance and point of order origin. Point of order acceptance is where the merchant or the seller accepted the order. And that could be different than from where that seller, let's say if it was a product order, shipped the order from. So if you think about it, I might have my primary facility where I take phone orders, where I receive faxed orders in Chicago, but I ship from DeKalb, Illinois. So I have a point of order acceptance in Chicago as the seller, and then I ship from DeKalb. And in those scenarios, and in Illinois in particular, point of order acceptance is going to play a part in sourcing the appropriate tax jurisdictions. And then finally, point of order origin. This is where the buyer has originated its order. And many times that could be the bill to address, or it could be a very specific place where that primary location for the buyer is, but might be having products shipped elsewhere. All four of those addresses can impact the sourcing, the identification of the appropriate tax jurisdiction. And accordingly, the Avalara service, or the AvaTax service, provides an address validation capability. And what we permit you to do is, as new customer addresses are loaded into your ERP, you can then call the AvaTax service dynamically, have it validate that is an accurate address, and if it validates successfully, it will return a normalized response. Normalizing that response here in the United States for a USPS or United States Postal Service preferred format. If that happens to be a Canadian address, then we're using the Canada Post preferred format. So not only do we validate that you have a good address, but in our response, we will normalize that address so that you can have a continuity of the way that you're storing and maintaining all of your addresses within your database.
Hey, Mark, we have a question.
Yes.
Kari is asking, is the last 4 digits of a zip code necessary?
What will happen is, so we do make use of that full address when doing the tax calculation. In our normalization efforts, we will return the zip +4 in the normalization response. And that takes us, and actually it's a very good question. So first of all, yes, that is important for us, but we will provide assistance in determining what is the accurate +4 or the full zip9 U.S. postal code. And part of that comes in the next section here is managing the response. And here's an example of an internally built Avalara integration or connector in the response from the address validation call. And you'll see over here on the left side of the screen, this was the address as input within the ERP or the accounting solution. And you'll see here I had 9045 Judicial as the address line 1, apartment 1316 on address line 2. I did put in a city, state, and I put in a zip code, but just the 5-character zip. And what happened is when the response came back, first of all, we did successfully validate the address. You'll see that here in our response message. But we also popped this window and identify the original address and then the validated and normalized address. And in the normalized address, you'll first of all see that down here we did add in the zip +4 or the 4-character extension on that 5-zip that I originally had. So added in the 4649 for accuracy. You'll also note it added in the drive reference for 9045 Judicial Drive. It also normalized the apartment reference and put that in because this is a U.S. address, the U.S. Postal Service preferred format. So yes, the +4 is important for us, but we provide address validation services to get you to that zip +4. And also had my person that was entering this address into my ERP, let's say put in the zip code as, was completely wrong. Maybe it was a state of Washington zip code. We would have corrected that as part of the validation and normalization process. Hopefully that answered your question. So address validation, very important for us, allowing you to pre-validate addresses. So first of all, that you get an accurate tax calculation, but also the residual effect is if this is associated with the product shipment, you now have a normalized address that will ease in postal or shipping process, and you'll ensure that it is going to the right address because you have a validated address.
Hey, Mark. Lee Legrand is asking, where is the validated address updated?
What we do is, what we recommend is in the integration, we take that address and then just drop it back into the normal repository from where you would maintain, in this case, a customer address, whether that be the bill to ship to address. But that would be recorded back in and overwritten over the address as entered. The integration will now overwrite that and update the address to the validated and normalized address. Moving on, we now know that we have an accurate address to calculate and use to calculate and determine the appropriate tax. Part of the next step is I've perhaps have onboarded a new customer, I've entered in their customer information, I've included their shipping address, I've validated that shipping address and normalized it through the Avalara service. I'm now ready to take and provide them an estimate or perhaps a quote or a sales order, depending on what your process is to go from quote to cash. At any point in time that you're dealing with an estimate, a quote, a sales order, a return order, or even a purchase order if you're on the buy side of the scenario, Avalara can provide a tax estimate, taking the information in the order, the addresses associated with that order, and calculating a tax. Part of that on an estimate, quote, or a sales order will give you an identifier for the buyer as to the true total cost of ownership, because I might have a product on there, I might have some service I'm providing, as well as a shipping charge. And now I'm adding on the tax estimate to give them a complete total cost of ownership, especially important for high ticket items where there may be budgetary concerns, and perhaps buying new office equipment at $10,000, it's going to be important to understand that I might have a 9 or 10% tax rate that is now going to boost the charge from not only $10,000, but to an amount with that 9 or 10% tax on there. On purchase orders, it's also very good internally if you're using the AvaTax service on a purchase order to estimate the tax that you should be paying. Again, that is very important, identifying total cost of ownership, and especially in the same scenario, if I'm looking at and having budgetary concerns about my purchase, I want to make sure that I know all of the costs that are going to be incorporated on this buy. And then finally, we'll provide you with a variety of tax types. If you're here in the United States and you're requesting a quote or an estimate on the tax, you can get a sales tax return. If you're working in Canada, we would return GST, applicable PST or HST, depending on the province. If you're working internationally, especially in Europe, we would return a value-added tax type. And then there's additional fees and estimates or assessments that we can associate. Battery recycling fees is one of those. So if you're selling batteries and there is a recycling fee associated with that battery that you should be charging the end consumer, then we have the ability to document that. We can drop that on the order, on the quote, on the estimate, again, to give you that total cost of ownership. And then you want to make sure you document that estimate. And by documenting that estimate, I mean getting it recorded on the order so that it displays appropriately, so when that order is received either by mail, electronic means, or any type of means, you have that accurate estimate on there, and they now have total cost of ownership. If there's any questions, you can resolve those questions before you go to order fulfillment and shipping. If there's concerns about the tax rate being charged, or perhaps should tax be charged, is this an exempt purchase, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And finally, when dealing with estimating tax, if you look at our Create Transaction API method in our developer website, you'll see that there are a variety of doc types. When dealing with a sales transaction and wanting to generate an estimate, quote, order, or even a return order, you may want to use the sales order doc type. What that will do is it will call the AvaTax service, It will calculate tax based upon the order and address information being passed. And it will return a response back that you can consume on that document within your ERP or accounting solution. However, you're not going to persist that transaction within the AvaTax service. It is just an estimate, a quote order. It is not a permanent transaction from an Avalara perspective. And as part of that estimating process, you'll see that I'm now going to, we'll have a bit of a detour or a side note here on customs duty and import tax. And this is compliant shipping across borders. And in many cases, especially on one-off orders that are shipping across international borders, there can be customs duty or an import tax or an import tax that is assessed on that. The AvaTax service is now able to do those types of estimates. But before we get into talking about what that looks like, first of all, identifying for those of you that may not be familiar with what a customs duty is, and I'm just going to read off of this. So this is from the, you'll see my source, businessdictionary.com. And a customs duty is a tax levied on imports and sometimes on exports by customs authorities of a country to raise state revenue and or protect domestic industries from more efficient or predatory competitors abroad. Customs duty is based generally on the value of goods or upon the weight, dimensions, and some other criteria of the item, such as size of the engine in case of automobiles. As you're aware, tariffs, customs duty has been in the news a lot. There's a lot of different countries positioning themselves with how they will tax and tariff and put duty on various types of imports from other countries. What Avalara is providing is the ability to identify, especially on individual shipments of goods, maybe not bulk movement of goods from one country to another to maybe put in a warehouse, but more on the case of merchant shipping goods sold to individual end customers that are going to cross a border and want to be able to put an estimate of the duty and import tax that is associated with that. Part of that process is the merchant will be coordinating a shipment with a logistics agent or freight forwarder to get it across and through customs in the other country. But what the AvaTax service will allow you to do is at the time that you're generating the estimate, the quote, or the order, is to call the AvaTax service, provide us information about that shipment of good, including an HS code or harmonized system code that will identify specifically the type of product. And it will then allow you to identify what the customs duty and any import tax will be due whenever that end consumer is receiving that order from the shipping agent. And many times that will be due on demand, meaning, for example, if it's a shipment to an individual's home, the UPS driver, the FedEx driver, or the local delivery service will then be insisting upon getting that customs duty and import tax before they render the good to that end consumer. So as not to provide a surprise at that time of delivery, you can put those estimates and for customs duty and import tax directly on your order, or even associate that with your invoice to show this is the amount of tax or customs duty that will be due upon delivery. In addition, you can, if you are collecting that upfront and remitting that to the customs agent yourself, you can then do a charge call, which will allow AvaTax to calculate and charge at order fulfillment, at order and at fulfillment. So including customs duty and import tax will take care of providing a good experience for your end customer when you are doing those individual shipments of goods across the border, and a customs duty and import tax will be due to the end customer when they receive that good. And Jeff, I believe in the future we're going to be doing some additional webinars around the specifics of customs duty and import tax. Is that correct?
Correct.
Next, we're going to work on finalizing tax. So much like the same process that you went through at estimate, at quote, at order, the same types of data will be necessary to finalize the tax on your invoice. Here, the key components are being able to display the final tax on that invoice, so it's very clear as to what the end customer is paying. We also want to ensure that that transaction or that invoice is committed within the AvaTax service so that you provide reporting for the ERP end user, your accountants, your tax team, your bookkeeper, depending on who is doing and managing your tax liability. That will provide the ability to report that information so that the sales tax over the course of, let's say, a month, a quarter, can be reported and reconciled with the general ledger. And finally, having accurate reports to remit that tax to the appropriate taxing authority. There is a need to display the accurate tax on the invoice. You want to include any additional fees, charges, so that if there is a battery tax, a recycling fee that's coming from the sale of a battery, or a tax e-waste fee like a similar recycling fee on monitors. We will have that information. We will present that back in the response. From your perspective, what you'll need to do is capture that information and display it appropriately on the invoice. Then you'll also want to ensure that not only is the invoice updated, but within your ERP, you'll want to commit the final tax. For a sales-related transaction, the sales tax, you'll want to, first of all, update the information on the invoice where that tax, where the ERP or accounting solution expects to see tax. You'll want to ensure that that flows through then and is able to create the appropriate journal entry, showing not only the revenue or the sales amount associated with the products being shipped, maybe recognizing the shipping charge that's been captured in my general ledger, but then also hitting my sales tax liability account to show the full amount of tax that I've charged the customer and is now a liability for me to remit to the taxing authority. And making sure all of that rolls up to the total cost or the total amount on the invoice that is being recorded in your accounts receivable. Also, you'll want to finalize and commit that invoice in AvaTax. And as I mentioned earlier, on this section where we were talking about document type within the Create Transaction API method, there is a sales invoice document type. And what that will do is that will persist the transaction or the invoice within the AvaTax service for your ERP user, your accountant, your bookkeeper to then see that invoice. And there is also the ability to commit that to show that that is finalized. Committing the invoice shows that it is now a permanent invoice and it has completed all of the process through your ERP and is likely posted to your general ledger in the ERP.
Hey Mark, there's a question from Vivek. He asks, do you have two different APIs for estimation and finalization?
It's one API method. The Create Transaction method allows you to select the document type or doc type. And you'll see there's a variety. On the sales side, there's sales invoice and sales order. Sales invoice is the transaction or the transact doc type that will persist the transaction within the AvaTax service. The sales order doc type will be the one that calls the service, calculates the tax, and returns the tax in a response, but does not persist it. But it's all happening through the same API method. And Bob or Wayne, did I miss anything on that? There are other calls that you can call to get tax.
Yeah, if you prefer upserts in your workflow, there's create or adjust transaction, and that's kind of an API endpoint to rule them all. There's some little additional complexities, but again, that's just we've created that endpoint just to adapt to customers' internal workflow.
And then use tax side, you can commit use tax within the AvaTax service so that you can show that you are self-assessing a tax that the supplier should have charged you but didn't, or maybe they undercharged you tax, and you need to then do a self-assessment to report and remit that self-assessed tax on the purchase to the appropriate taxing authority. There's a similar process, but there is a purchase order and purchase invoice, and we have the ability to do create and record the accrual journal entry. And the only thing that I'll point out here is, unlike the sales tax, in sales tax, we do want to show that the total amount of my invoice includes that sales tax amount, because that's what I'm going to charge my end customer, and I expect them to pay that full amount, including the tax, and remit that back to me. And then the amount of tax will be my responsibility to then capture, record as a liability until I file my tax return reporting that collected tax. On the use tax side, I will self-assess use tax. However, I don't want to include the amount of use tax that I've assessed on my purchase invoice. I do not want that money to flow back to my supplier. I need to hold that money, and it's basically an assessment and an accrual of an amount, of a future amount that I owe to the taxing authority. So you'll want to create the journal entries appropriately, identifying the separation between what I'm actually going to pay and remit to my supplier versus the amount of use tax that I am self-assessing and accruing that I will remit separately to the taxing authority. And again, that same finalize and commit invoice in AvaTax is that same process, using, in this case, a purchase invoice document and then indicating when that purchase invoice is committed or final. Finalizing and committing those transactions then provides the ability to report through the Avalara service. And here's another place where it's going to be a benefit to you, because as the technical side, you're not going to have to modify or do anything with your ERP reports to better identify tax that's been collected, what my liability is, or audit records for my tax liabilities. The AvaTax service will maintain reporting for your users, your tax department, your accountant, bookkeeper, within our service, and have a variety of reports, even those types of reports that will allow them to transpose numbers onto a tax return and file and remit. Refunds, the unfortunate part of the selling process. There are always occasions where I have a end customer that is going to return the product. Maybe there was a defect, maybe it was not the product they thought they ordered, or perhaps they're asking for a discount or a partial refund. Avalara will provide you the ability to do accurate tax refunds and then apply those to the refund, to the credit memo, or the return invoice document. The same process holds true here. There are order types and invoice types. A return order is going to then calculate the tax that should be due and refunded to the customer on the return order, if that's part of your process of accepting and going through the process of identifying the customer who wants to return or refund something and getting that through the process. If a return order is in there, you can assess the amount of tax that will be refunded when that return actually processes. And again, the return invoice will do the same, calculate the tax that is due, and it will return that. We do provide a refund API. This will take a lot of the heavy lifting out of the process for you. This is particularly useful if you're refunding an entire invoice. I've sold a product, and I've invoiced it. I'm now accepting the product back and giving a full refund. The refund API will identify the invoice. It will pick up key information, not only, and most importantly, the original invoice date And that original invoice date was the date that was used to calculate the tax that was charged to the customer on the sales invoice. We will now go back in time and pick up the same tax content as of the date of the sale to make sure that we're refunding using the same tax rate, tax content, and tax information. However, we will separate the document date because today on, let's say, May 21st, I may be generating a credit memo for a sale that I did back in perhaps on March 15th. So we'll pick up the original invoice date of March 15th, use that as the tax date override to say, use this date to calculate tax, March 15th, the date of the original sale, but put my document date as May 21st so that it picks up and gets included in my May activity. There is also the ability to do a tax amount override. Tax amount override is for a scenario where you're going to indicate the amount of tax you're refunding and not have AvaTax calculated. It's not our preferred method, but there are certain scenarios that it may be required, or you may just wish to do it in that fashion. And you can do that and indicate on the return invoice, here is the return invoice, and here is the amount of tax I'm giving you to show as the refunded amount. The AvaTax service will pick that up, and it will capture it and report that. Keep in mind, though, the onus now is on your organization because you're identifying the tax amount as opposed to having the AvaTax service calculate the amount for you. And then you'll want to do an accurate recording of the refund, the credit memo or return, and again, going through the finalization process and making sure that refund transaction is committed within the AvaTax service so that it is picked up on your reports as well as on your tax liability that's due the taxing authority. And Bob and Wayne, on the refunds, anything else that you might add in there? Tips or tricks that you may have learned over the years?
You know, with the refunds API endpoint, you do have some options to specify if you want to return a specific line or a partial amount. So there's a lot of flexibility in there with the refunds API. So I encourage folks to take a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly what he said. There are a few fields that you can set to further refine how the refund transaction method works for you. Definitely encourage you to check out the documentation on refund transaction because it isn't just a blanket refund.
Excellent. Thank you. We'll talk briefly about exemption certificate management. And there are certain scenarios when you're onboarding a new customer, and that customer may indicate that they are buying your product and perhaps they're a reseller of your product. So they're making the purchase. They're not going to be the end consumer. And here in the United States, that indicates that if they're not the end consumer, then they shouldn't be charged tax. However, they have to provide documentation to the seller, to your organization, that they are truly exempt from tax and provide you the necessary exemption certificate. Using Avalara Cert Capture along with the AvaTax service for tax calculation, through Cert Capture, there are APIs available to allow you to manage your exempt customers so that you can automate the collection, application, and reporting of your exemption certificates you have from your various end customers. You have the ability to manage exempt customers. So as you're onboarding that customer and recording that customer within your ERP, you can make a call directly from the ERP to say, add this customer to Cert Capture because this is a customer that is claiming an exemption. You can also make a similar call to edit that customer information if they have a name change, they have an address change, maybe they have a primary contact change. You can then also use Avalara APIs to update Cert Capture to say, here is the customer. And then through an API, you can actually, from your ERP, call the Cert Capture solution to electronically request the exemption certificate directly from the end customer. So the ability to provide exemption certificate management functions through Cert Capture, but not requiring the end user to log into Cert Capture to go in and manage that activity. They can do it as they're processing that customer within the ERP or the accounting solution. And then on the back end, after I've entered that customer within CertCapture, I've recorded the exemption certificate request, and that's gone out to the end customer to electronically fulfill and remit back to CertCapture solution for you. From that same customer record, you can check on the status of the exemption certificate request. Is it still pending? Has the end user looked at it? Maybe they've responded and returned the exemption certificate electronically, but it hasn't gone through the appropriate approval process, or maybe it's approved and it's a valid certificate. And then finally, you can also retrieve an image of that exemption certificate. Again, through your customer record, manage your exemption activities so that your end users don't have to log into a separate portal to go in and do their day-to-day activities. And then you can also use entity use code. That is a reference to identify a type of exemption. That is, if you're not using CertCapture, you can pass that along in the tax calculation request to identify the type of exemption your customer is claiming, or you can just return a generic exemption number in the exemption number field, and we'll generically apply the exemption. On the latter two, entity use code and exemption number, if you're not using CertCapture, then the onus remains on your accounting team, your credit department, to capture the exemption certificate themselves and then manually file that away to have that record on file for audit purposes. And as an example, this is the window that we have pop up in one of the Avalara integrations to say, I want to add my customer to my exemption certificate management solution or CertCapture. And you'll see it's some very basic information that we're needing to gather, but it is information that can be updated automatically through our API set. And then finally, provide user self-service. One of the things that you want to do is a lot of the different controls, the way that the integration should work, provide the necessary end user controls so the end users can make the necessary updates, configuration settings themselves, rather than have to go through an engineering or development team to go in and make updates to the integration through a hard-coded method. Provide those self-service user controls, authentication, being able to currently in our current model for authentication, providing the account number and license key through a secure method and giving the user the ability to manage that themselves. When we move into a more OAuth scenario, being able to provide access to authentication through that control or configuration window. We also recommend doing service enablement, allowing the end user to turn on and off address validation, the tax calculation, or the exemption certificate management through an integration control, so that maybe as I'm onboarding the AvaTax solution, I want to disable the tax calculation and address validation until I get everything set up, and then at one point turn that on so I know that I have one control that allows the enablement and disablement of any of the Avalara services you've integrated into your ERP or accounting solution. You can also manage exemption processing. You can manage logging through that. And as an example, here's one of the windows. It's probably a little busy, but you can see we have where we have the ability to put in my account credentials, authenticate those. I can then put different controls. You'll see here I can disable tax calculation. I can indicate whether I want to use entity use code or not. Other controls such as passing UPC as an item code, and then address validation, again, enabling and disabling that, and other controls around the integration and how that integration operates for your end users to manage. With that, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. I've got developer resources on here. We'll cover those in a little bit, but let's give some time now to see if we have any questions, Jeff.
You've answered all of them so far. I would encourage everyone to hit Mark and everyone else in the room with questions about ERP. We've got about 15 minutes left in the call if needed for questions, so we are ready and waiting.
And while we're waiting for those to come in, couple links here, and we will be posting this webinar
In the next week or so.
But we have a developer site. It's developer.avalara.com. But some quick links here. We have a quick start guide for ERP and accounting system developers. It's a brief guide. It'll cover a lot of the information I covered in today's session, and it really gives you an idea of what's necessary to integrate an Avalara service, whether it be AvaTax or the address validation piece within your ERP. We also have interactive demos to be able to start calculating tax. You'll see here the link, the AvaTax demo link. And also, if you're looking at building an integration and you haven't worked with Avalara as of yet, you can get a free 60-day production account and access to the AvaTax API through our developer website.
Okay, I've got a question, if there's no other waiting guests.
We do have one. One moment. Sorry, Sarah. Okay. This is from Ted Hammock. Do you have a webinar for developers that covers coding examples of the various functions, IBMI/RPG/ILE environment? Not presently.
Not a webinar, but the document's actually really
well
detailed.
The documentation for the AS400 IBMI systems is really thorough. So I'd recommend, Jeff, if you haven't checked out that documentation, head over to our developer site and click on the SDK link, and you should be able to find that from there.
Great, I will find that and pop it in there.
Actually, I'm displaying it now. Oh, I went to the wrong one.
Jeff, I'll find you the link so we can get it over to him.
Which one is it?
The IBMI documentation.
Yeah, please send me the link. You'll get it over there. Great. Okay, Sarah, your question, please.
Well, for everybody that's in the room, we've helped a lot of developers build integrations to ERP systems. You know, is there any resounding theme of spots where people get stuck in their, like, are there spots that people always get stuck at building, or just kind of some tricky things that people always ask questions about?
In developer relations, one of the common sticky wickets we see is using the wrong document type when they're creating their transaction. They often skip the step of using sales order, which causes a transaction count blow. In general, we encourage you to use document type of sales order, which is an estimate, up until the point where you consider the transaction revenue received. Once you consider it revenue received, then create your transaction with a sales invoice. That's probably one of the most common issues.
Bob, is that your experience too?
Yeah. No, Wayne hit it on the mark there. We want to make sure that when we're looking to get a quote out of the tax system or out of the tax engine, that we process the document with that sales order doc type, so the document doesn't persist in AvaTax and clutter up reports and whatnot. Yeah.
The other best practice we encourage as you're working on your implementation is use the reference code or the document code. Set it yourself. If you don't have to set it, but AvaTax will give you back a GUID if you don't set that field. GUIDs mean nothing to humans or your tax professionals. So by setting that with your own internal document code, you now have an ability to quickly retrieve that from AvaTax using your own internal identifier.
A million times I agree with you on that.
We have another question from Patricia Marlin regarding freight charges. Are standard shipping and expedited shipping handled differently?
Typically not. The key driver for most shipping is identifying, are you charging or just passing along the freight or shipping charge that your, let's say, UPS, FedEx, USPS is charging you, or at least making a concerted effort to marry up the two, that the amount that you charge for shipping accurately reflects the amount that the shipper is charging. So we typically look at that as the key driver. Now, if you have expedited shipping where you're adding on an additional handling fee separately, you'll want to classify those two separately and say that this is the fee. The fee will be identified through an Avalara tax code versus the handling charge versus the shipping charge. So that will help determine the appropriate taxing of that shipping charge. But just having, moving from a 2-day ship to a ground ship 8-day or 7 or 8 day charge in and of itself doesn't change the nature of the taxability. It's accurately passing along that tax. Also, many states actually identify the taxability of the shipping follows the taxability of the items being shipped. Our service will take that into account when you document your shipping charge with the appropriate Avalara tax code, which is a goods and services category essentially. We'll identify those states that have tax following the taxability of the shipping following the taxability of the item being shipped. So if we see a taxable item being shipped, we'll then flag the shipping charge as taxable. If it's a non-taxable item, let's say it's a food product that's non-taxable, we'll then make the shipping charge non-taxable. So we take that complexity out of it for you, but it is getting the correct tax code or goods and services category associated with that charge. So the AvaTax service understands what's being charged and then can look up the appropriate tax rules depending on where you're shipping that product to.
Okay, we have 2 other questions. The first from Josh Berman is, for systems that manage orders but post them to a separate accounting application for AR, excuse me, what would the recommendation be as far as when to post the invoice document? When the shipment posts to the AR, or perhaps the user should come back when the invoice is paid to post to the service?
We typically, in accrual accounting, we're going to recommend that the invoice gets committed when the sale is recognized.
Does everybody know what accrual accounting is?
So there's
You do.
accrual accounting and cash basis accounting. Accrual accounting is the more common, which is I'm booking my revenue based upon when I generate the invoice and fulfill the order. Whereas cash basis accounting is I only recognize the revenue at the time when I get paid. Typically, only smaller organizations will use a cash basis. So we typically look to have the transaction committed when the order is fulfilled and invoiced, and you're recognizing the revenue in your general ledger. Now, when you post that really depends on when, or commit that, when the invoice is truly reflected as finalized. Meaning if you are processing through, let's say, an order management system and processing the invoice there, but I still can take the invoice once it passes over to my accounts receivable and edit it within accounts receivable. I don't want to commit it at the OMS side. I want to wait and commit it once it's finalized in AR. However, if my OMS is only passing a completed finalized invoice, which is just going to record for accounts receivable purposes for tracking the payment, then I want to commit whenever the OMS finalizes the invoice, because I no longer can edit or change that.
Okay, and the next question is from Michael Lestick. Where is product exemption handled? I have read about the rules database, but have been unable to find where that resides. As a follow-up, is the management of those rules our responsibility?
So when you say product exemption, I'm guessing that you're talking about the identification of whether a particular product in a particular state is taxable or non-taxable. The AvaTax service will manage that for you, but the key piece of information that the seller needs to provide us is assigning the tax code. And Avalara has a standardized set of tax codes. And actually what I'll do here is, if you go to taxcode.avatax.avalara.com is where you can look up various tax codes. And what you'll do is for each of the lines on your order or your invoice, you'll associate a tax code with that based upon the SKU or SKU group of what's being sold. When that tax code Avalara tax code comes along, we then use the address, as you remember, to identify the tax jurisdictions that are assigned. And then we look at the tax rules associated with each of those tax codes for those jurisdictions to determine, is it a taxable event or a non-taxable event, or maybe a special tax rate or a partial exemption.
I think it's important to note that the rules that, or the tax codes that you put up on the screen, Mark, those are the ones that Avalara maintains the rules behind, but customers and merchants have the flexibility to create their own codes and their own rules within the AvaTax engine as well. So within their account, they can create their own custom tax code and their own custom rules to suit their product needs.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left, time for probably one more question. Vivek is asking, for service-based businesses, is there a way to test entertainment tax using www.avataxrates.com?
No, not in entertainment taxes. Avalara is supporting entertainment taxes. The avataxrates.com is solely showing general sales tax jurisdiction information or boundary information. There are different jurisdictional boundaries for different types of entertainment and resort taxes. Avalara maintains that. It's just not part of what's displayed on avataxrates.com. That is solely sales tax only.
Great. Okay, and so I want to just wrap up and thank everybody for coming to the webinar. I hope you found it helpful. As Mark indicated, we'll have a recording of it available in 4 or 5 days. In the meantime, I did upload a handout of the ERP guide to the webinar service, so everyone should be able to download that. I also put URLs to our API demo and the ERP guide as well as the free trial. Thank you, everybody, and have a great day.